In June of 1983, a strange smell in the back of an Air Canada DC-9 quickly turned into an all-out emergency. For 15 minutes, passengers and crews struggled to deal with thick, toxic smoke as it rolled through the plane. Flight 797 made a remarkable landing, only to burst into flames 90 seconds later. "23 people didn't escape the plane. Now the burnt shell of the DC-9 sits on the runway at the Greater Cincinnati Airport. It's one of the most disturbing airplane disasters in years. Within the hour, investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board are on the scene. The first grim task of the investigators is to recover the bodies of the dead. 21 Canadians and 2 Americans. Many are burned beyond recognition. Almost all of the victims are found in the front half of the plane, between the wings and the cockpit. Some are still strapped into their seats. Others are found in the aisles. And even though all the passengers had been moved up earlier in the flight, 2 bodies are found near the rear, beyond the wings.
Because of the dense smoke in the cabin, the passengers couldn't see well enough to find the exits. And 2 passengers went beyond the overwing exits and succumbed to the environment.
Investigators take blood samples from the bodies. They find deadly levels of certain chemicals that were produced as the plane burned.
When we did toxicological studies, we were able to determine that there were some significant high levels of cyanide and fluoride in the blood, as well as carbon monoxide.
It's not known if the toxic fumes killed the passengers. All that's certain is that they were unable to escape before the flames tore through.
When I went on board, I was just struck by the acrid smell. It was kind of eerie because there was a lot of fire damage. A lot of the fuselage was burned. You know, the interior of the cabin was burned down to the tops of the seats.
With the bodies removed, investigators begin digging through the wreckage to try and find the cause of the fire. Among them are members of the FBI.
They were investigating to determine whether terrorism might have been a factor, so they were on scene right away looking at the aircraft to make that determination.
The FBI examines pieces of the plane's floor, samples of water from the washroom, even a plastic vial found on the floor.
The FBI became involved very early because of the possibility of a crime taking place takes precedent over a accident. They were looking for anything that would have to do with an incendiary device or small explosive device or anything that could be fused to start a fire. They determined that there was no evidence of any crime being committed. It was probably accidental ignition, and so they then left and NTSB took over the accident.
Having discounted the possibility that the fire was deliberately set, investigators consider the next obvious cause: a cigarette. When smoking on planes was still allowed, the most common source of fires in a washroom was the trash container. Investigators examine the trash container and find that the top is burned away, but the trash chute and the container behind and below the sink are intact. Inside the container are remnants of paper, scorched but not burned. The fire could not have started here. With the most obvious potential causes discounted, investigators begin to comb through the wreckage looking for what had started the fire. Studying the history of the plane, Hill uncovers some startling facts. In the year before the accident, 76 separate maintenance issues had been written up in the plane's logbook. All were dealt with, but still, it's an unusually high number of problems. The plane's troubled history didn't end there. 4 years earlier, the rear bulkhead had failed, causing an explosive decompression. The crew had to make an emergency landing.
It knocked out a lot of electrical cable and hydraulics and stuff like that, and the guy did a hell of a job bringing it back to Boston.
The plane was repaired and put back into service, but Hill focuses on the wires that had to be stitched together after the accident. A bad repair job could have been the cause of the fire.
There were wires that ran through there that had been cut, spliced back together.
Investigators study all the wire splices they can find on Flight 797 that weren't destroyed in the fire, but they find no evidence of arcing or short-circuiting. It's another dead end. Investigators turn their attention to the cockpit voice recorder and the popping circuit breakers.
What was that? It's right there, I see it. Right there.
Yeah.
Like a machine gun. Yeah. Zap, zap, zap.
The circuit breakers trip as a precaution. When they begin to overheat, the circuit breakers turn off, cutting electrical current to the motor. It's a safety feature, so the motor won't cause a fire.
Pops as I push it.
Investigators need to know if the breakers were tripped by a fire that had already started, or was the motor itself the problem? The NTSB build a mock-up of the plane's washroom and force the flush motor to seize. They want to see if it could have started the fire. The seized motor reaches a temperature of 428 degrees Celsius. It's hot, but it's not hot enough to ignite parts of the washroom around the motor. As they listen to the cockpit voice recorder, investigators uncover a puzzling clue. 3 minutes before the circuit breakers popped, the recorder picked up another noise. It was the sound of electrical arcing, like static, repeated 8 times. The noises weren't audible to the crew. Hidden from view on any airplane is a river of wiring. Investigators focus on a cable coming from a generator below the washroom floor. Insulation had rubbed off 2 wires, making it possible for sparks to be produced, sparks that could start a fire.
There was evidence that there was some electrical arcing, but it could have occurred after the insulation had burned on those wires.
In spite of countless hours of investigation and numerous tests, in the end, the NTSB can't pinpoint the exact cause of the fire. There simply isn't enough evidence.
Just because of the vast amount of damage that was done in that concentrated area around the lavatory where the fire burnt for a long period of time and possibly destroyed any of the evidence of where the fire actually ignited.
Even if they'll never know the exact cause of the fire, investigators try to understand how it could cause so much damage. There had been heat and smoke, but no one had seen any flames until an explosion ripped through the jet.
When you have a fire that has incomplete combustion, when it has a lack of oxygen, they will produce combustible gases. Those gases then can collect, especially in the crown of an aircraft.
The fire had burned out of sight behind the washroom walls, and the smoke, hot gases and fumes intensified and spread inside the wall space from the washroom through to the cabin walls. Those spaces acted as a sort of chimney for the gases and smoke that the fire was creating. Although the fire remained concealed behind the walls and ceiling panels, the smoke and hot gases entered the cabin through every seam, gathering in the upper space in the cabin and pressing down on the passengers.
The inaccessible areas and the cabin area are all linked together through small cracks and crevices and small openings. The plane is one big pressure vessel with everything being the same, equilibrated to the same pressure. So smoke and gases in those areas would fairly quickly start to permeate into the passenger cabin.
When the doors were opened during the evacuation, an unlimited supply of oxygen was suddenly available to feed the fire. The more intense the heat, the more oxygen-hungry a fire becomes. The gas is ignited with the force of an explosion.
And once you have a flashover, you produce heat, toxic gases, and you burn up all the oxygen in the cabin, and it becomes non-survivable.
The technical part of the investigation is complete. But there are still a lot of questions about how the crew responded to the fire.
The first off is that it's starting to clear now, and at that point I reckon that the fire was under control.
Could they have done more to prevent the tragedy on board Flight 797? In 1983, a washroom fire on an Air Canada DC-9 filled the plane's cabin with smoke. The crew struggled to land the plane, but a flash fire ripped through the jet moments after it came to a stop. 23 people were killed.
There was a fireman hollering at us. I think the quote was, "She could blow at any minute."
NTSB investigators are unable to definitively pinpoint the cause of the fire. But after reviewing all the information they have, they're ready to release their report. The report on the lethal fire aboard Air Canada Flight 797 is published a year after the accident. It's a landmark in aircraft safety, but it immediately makes for controversial headlines. The NTSB points out that the source of the smoke was never identified, either by the flight attendants or the first officer. The captain was never told, nor did he inquire as to the precise location and extent of the fire which had been reported to him.
And with that in mind, what type of fire did you believe that you had?
The bin fire.
Mayday, Mayday, Mayday.
And the report asks a hypothetical question.
Canada 797, we have a fire on board. We are going down.
Can you possibly make Cincinnati?
Roger that.
If he'd begun to descend sooner, could the captain have landed at Standiford Field Airport in Louisville, Kentucky? It was a few minutes closer. The report and the media attention it gets are devastating to Captain Cameron and his crew. Soon after the report is released, there's an outcry among pilots in the industry. They resent its implied criticism of Flight 797's crew and the suggestion that they could have begun their descent 5 minutes sooner. Several months later, the Airline Pilots Association submits a petition that defends Cameron and the crew. It makes an impact. The NTSB release a revised report, including the petition by the Airline Pilots Association. In the petition, First Officer we met writes an impassioned defense of landing the plane where and when they did. The issue wasn't only the distance to the nearest airport, but the required rate of descent. As it was, the plane barely made the descent to the Greater Cincinnati Airport. Still, the National Transportation Safety Board's revised summary doesn't pull all its punches, pointing a finger at Captain Cameron. The report states that the time taken to evaluate the nature of the fire and to decide to initiate an emergency descent contributed to the severity of the accident. 20 years later, the statement still stings.
I'm glad they were all, the people that got off. I'm very sorry that the people that didn't get off, because we spent a lot of time and effort getting them there. That really bothered me. All I know is that I did the best I could.
Along with the comments on the performance of the crew, the NTSB recommends a host of safety improvements. Perhaps if the flight had been full, someone would have noticed the smell of smoke sooner. But what the washroom of Flight 797 could have used was a smoke detector. They weren't standard throughout the industry, but after Flight 797, attitudes and regulations changed. Even though flight attendants did receive some training in dealing with fires aboard a plane, it didn't go far enough. But what was more obvious, the flight attendants weren't properly equipped to attack fires. Without full-face masks and oxygen, they couldn't be expected to fight fire while holding their breath. In the years after Flight 797, attendants received better equipment and training. The cabin crew had also made split-second decisions that helped save lives. Moving passengers further up the plane and handing out wet towels minimized the effects of the toxic smoke. Their decision to tell passengers to open the emergency exits over the wings was not standard procedure, but it let some passengers escape more quickly and was eventually adopted as a routine practice. Finally, it became obvious from the location of some of the bodies that passengers died because of precious seconds lost trying to find the exits in the pitch dark. What would have made a difference? Track lighting on the floors and bumps along the overhead bins that identified the rows with emergency exits. Features that would eventually become standard.
As a direct result of 797, a number of rules were changed, including a more stringent test for seats, a heat release and smoke requirement for cabin interior panels, requirement for smoke detectors in lavatories, and halon fire extinguishers in the cabin.
You're going to make an emergency landing. Put your head on your lap. Stand up.
But the changes were too late for those who died on Flight 797, like the man sitting beside Connie Kirsch. Months after the crash, his wife tracked Connie down.
She said, I just understand my husband was the one that was next to you, and I just wanted to know how was he? What was his spirits? And I said, he was in great spirits. He's very nice. He let me sit next to him and explained to me how to breathe. That was really difficult, you know, and the guilt that I carried for a long time was difficult. But I'm past the guilt, but I guess when you go back to it and you think about it like this in detail, you're right back there.
Stan Rogers was another victim of Flight 797. He would never be able to fulfill the promise of his life and growing career.
I loved his generosity and his loyalty as a friend. As an artist, he was perhaps one of the best songwriters this country's ever produced, and it was really an incredible pleasure and honor to be working with him. He still gets lots and lots of airplay, and so his legend grows.
Sometime after the accident, 2 Air Canada employees show up at Diane Fatley's door in Dallas.
They brought my Bible. It's dark because it was burned and singed, but It's a paperback Bible, and it did not completely burn up. This is just a reminder to me that God was with me. And I believe He protected me. And, you know, He was there with me.
Captain Cameron and his crew eventually received 6 separate awards for their heroic actions on Flight 797, including recognition from the Royal Canadian Air Force. But they're all still haunted by the nightmare.
You feel responsible, there's no question. You feel guilt, you're willing to give your license. You feel very, very small until you get all the facts together, and because it's a puzzle for you, you know, you're as much as a victim in this. You're not supposed to fly an airplane in that condition, you know, so you're as much as a victim as the passenger, and I think it becomes all of our problem, and we're all part of the solution.
It's just a shame we didn't get everybody off. It still bothers me.